Okay, this is the making video, which will be the entirety of all the time-lapse I took of construction with a voiceover. Obviously, this is not me working at the moment, as I was working away on the table that you see now. It's quite funny and quite nice in its way, although the top was very difficult to put on, and it had a lot of issues with how it actually looked. The actual plinths, which we're now on to making as we were moving quite fast through the day, were a three-sided box with a decoration piece put on the front. There was a plan of how to do everything, so doing it all was very efficient when we actually began to make it, because there was no real hold-ups other than there was a few measurements that were slightly off, and everything hadn't had corners or so many material thicknesses included, as the sizes of wood had recently changed, as well as it changing from MDF to plywood. This means that we did have a problem with splintering. With MDF it would split and it basically turns into dust. Plywood has a different problem, that it does not fall apart, but it does splinter and turn into fragments much more viciously. The plinths then had tops fitted and were finished, and we then moved on to a guttering that was to hold lights around the top of the set. Very simple, two pieces nailed at a right angle that were then cut with angled ends, which I do later on. A lot of the materials that we used are brad nails and Gorilla Glue. The reason for Gorilla and not PVA is it is slightly stronger and it does allow for slightly more strength in the material. We then moved on to building the TV case, which is the item you can now see on the workbench. This was a top and a bottom with a frame that was holding perspex on the inside. The frame itself was very quickly put together, nailing mostly from the top and the bottom into the pieces, and not particularly from the sides for the middle sections, as it was hard to get to. The plastic was then put in and held in with blocks, as well as a piece of card that was used to retain the material that we'd be filling it in, popcorn, as it was movie themed. Here you see me setting up a piece of wood that I come back to cut later, as I'll explain for why. The next thing that we were given is items came back into the workshop as they needed modifying. The plinths were found to be too unstable, so we were asked to fit bases to the bottom of these, which was very simple, just gluing the square and fitting it on once we'd set it up. The next section was to come back and cut that piece of wood I had been planning to do before. This was the front of the top part of the TV case, rather than any stand or table, that the TV would actually fit inside. The measurements that we had were eventually correct, so I began to cut it out with a jigsaw. In hindsight, using a rip saw or a handheld circular would have possibly been better, giving a straighter finish, but it wasn't really that much of a consideration, as a jigsaw should work fine with a guide rail, but it didn't work to the exact measurements that we wanted it. The next step was to fit the parts that I had onto the TV case to make the sides. There was a guide rail at the back to stop the TV from falling off from its stand when it was fitted in, and I fitted the parts together in the way that worked best, as the person who had all the technical details was not there. Unfortunately, this was wrong, and I had to remove the sides and reattach them in a different way, as they were too large for the actual box. This wasn't a problem, I had only just glued them, so I knocked them off with a pin hammer and re-nailed them after cutting them down. The next step was moved to the chop saw that you see in the front of the video, which was for cutting the bracings for the upright lattice works, as well as I used it to cut the angles for the guttering along the top of the set. The next step was to then take the lattice work that had been CNC'd on the laser cutter and glue and nail it together. There were 3 of these that we needed to do, however I don't believe I recorded all of them, as it is pretty much the same work for each one. After this, we then came back to making the last part of the set, which were the wings on either side of the set. These were made from strips of material that we cut and then re-nailed together, as they wanted little join lines between all of them. As the technicians were fed up of me keep asking them to do it, they taught me how to use the panel or the wall saw, which is the big saw that you see in front of you, as it was a lot easier than keep asking me to do work. However, not everything can be cut on that saw or the table saws, so they also left me with the work that had angles to cut. This was done on the big bandsaw, as it had the reach to cut these large parts. The technicians then went back to cutting all the other parts, as I was out of the room working on other parts. The last section that I actually have recorded is sorting out and organising the parts to make the wings. There was a long list of parts that were cut together, as well as in the background you see me finishing some bracing pieces that made up the joining cross braces behind these sections. Very simply, they were nailed to these pieces of wood and then were left to be painted and finished in a fairly uneven manner, as that was what was required by the design team. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Hopefully that is all I need, and hopefully next time it's good as well.